Wait, so Newton's laws of motion. Technically, this is the last. Ito na yung parang last discovery or law na na-create ni Sir Isaac Newton, which is laws of motion. So laws of motion consists of three laws that technically tell the story. Okay? Yung these three laws technically they are related to each other and pag-usapan natin kung bakit. Okay? Discuss natin pala. Ba't pag-usapan? Parang vlogging. Parang iba yung dating. So, discuss natin kung bakit ko nasabing uh, interconnected or related yung tatlong law of motion natin. First, so, proceed here tayo. Okay. So, Newton's law of motion, technically, this is the basis of formulation of mechanics. So, you will have the subject what we call engineering mechanics, and yung engineering mechanics natin is nahati sa static and dynamics. And technically, yun yung itong law na to, ito yung para magiging foundation natin. Okay? Yun ang banggit naman dyan. Newton's work is the foundation of classical or Newtonian mechanics. Classical mechanics describe the relation between the motion of objects found in our everyday world and the force acting on them. Okay? So, to summarize, ayan, nabanggit naman dito, to summarize the laws of motion, technically, the three laws are simple and sensible. First, the first law states that a force must be applied to an object in order to change its velocity. Okay, so either you increase it or decrease the velocity. So changing object's velocity technically creates an acceleration. Okay? Diba kung naalala nyo, if you remember discussion last week about the uniform accelerated motion, technically we have the formula for acceleration, which is the difference between two velocity with respect to time. Okay, so ganun din. Dito, di man technically negligible yung acceleration. Pero of course, kasama naman sa usapan yun. Okay, so which implies a relation. So yun na nga, when you change the velocity, it means you create an acceleration. So either you accelerate it or decelerate it. So it implies a relationship between force and acceleration. Kasi technically, once you apply the force, you will change the velocity. Once you change the velocity, there's a creation of acceleration. So, yung relationship between force and acceleration, nag-start na siya sa first law. And, technically, napag-uusapan na siya ngayon sa second law natin. Okay? So, this relationship, second law, states that the net force of an object equals the object's mass times its acceleration. So, pero sabi dito kung paano yung relationship, it does not technically tell us or define what is force, but technically define or tell us what is the relationship between them. Technically, force is, mas madidiscuss natin yung mamaya kung ano yung relationship nila. Okay, and finally, third law says that whenever we push on something, of course, that something technically pushes back with equal force and opposite direction. Okay? So, ito na yung pinaka-mismong summarize ng topic natin and we can now dismiss them. Joke lang. Okay, so proceed tayo ngayon to every law of motion natin. Okay? First, we have the Newton's first law of motion. So, ano nga ba yung first law of motion natin? Okay, so, pare-paras lang yung definition na yan, pero ayun, basahin natin one of them. Isa lang sa kanila. So, first, let's read the second bullet. Okay? Objects at rest tend to remain at rest, and objects in motion tend to remain in motion at the same speed and in the same direction unless acted by an external force. So technically, it says that once na there is no external force acting upon it or there is no outside force, okay, or net force na tinatawag, technically our object will remain on its state. Either it is in motion or either it is in rest. Okay? So, yun yung sinasabi sa first law of motion. Technically, may deeper understanding yon. Kaya ganon yung tendency ng object natin to stay on a certain state, either in motion man siya, either gumagalaw man siya, or at rest, or hindi. Kasi nga, ibig sabihin guys, is dahil yung forces inside of that object is in equilibrium. Okay? So, once na na-disrupt yung equilibrium nung forces inside of that object, technically, merong external force na nag-act doon. So, once na nagkaroon ng external force na nag-act doon sa object na yon, doon na tayo ngayon nagkaroon ng change in velocity. Okay? So, ayun yung parang pinakano nun. Kasi technically, first law of motion defines or tell us what is statics. Okay? So, ayun. Okay, so technically, sinasabi sa first law of motion nga na an object is always in equilibrium. In equilibrium. So, what do we mean by equilibrium? Pag sabi natin equilibrium, guys, ibig sabihin nun, yung force inside the object or all the forces, kahit ilang forces pa yung nag-act dun sa object na yun, technically, all of them are equal to zero. Once you add them or your sa may once you i-add nyo lahat yung forces na nag-act dun sa object na yun, technically, it is equal to zero. Okay? Yun yung idea ng static natin. Okay? So, engineering mechanics, statics. Okay? So, nangyayari dito, what will happen once na nag-apply ka ng force? Okay? So, technically, once na nag-apply ka ng force, madidisrupt yung equilibrium natin and mag-create siya ngayon ng change in velocity. Okay? So, either magdi-decrease yung velocity natin, either from at rest to motion or to motion to at rest. Okay? So, yun yung first law of motion natin. And technically, ang tawag doon sa state of, ano na yun, parang state of something, kung bakit nag-i-stay siya sa certain state niya, is what we call inertia. Okay? So, ayun yan. The tendency of an object to continue in its original state of motion is called inertia. Okay? So, yun yung Newton's first law of motion natin. So, sinasabi dito na an object is always in equilibrium. Okay? Or always, lahat ng forces niya in balance. Okay? Lahat naka-balance. Yung forces na lahat sa object na yon is in balance. Okay? So, sinasabi to, what will happen once we apply a force? Technically, once we apply an external force to an object, it will create a disruption and it will change its state of motion. Okay? And technically, inertia is directly proportional to its mass. The greater the mass, the greater the inertia, and the greater the and so on. Okay? So, sinasabi doon, guys, ba't natin relate yung mass and inertia? Kasi technically, object natin has a mass. Okay? So, every object, every matter has its own mass and it will not change. So, malalaman natin kung paano magbabago kung gaano kalaki yung probability na magbabago yung motion niya is depende sa mass niya. Kasi nga, mass is directly proportional to inertia. So, kung mataas yung inertia nyo, guys, technically, kailangan mo mag-exert ng higher force than the inertia para ma-disrupt yung equilibrium. Okay? So, yun yung first law of motion natin. So, technically, it tells us, ayun nga, what if nag-apply ka ng force? So, ngayon, punta tayo ngayon sa second law of motion. So, ano ngayon, so kung sa first law of motion, may nabanggit tayong force, guys. So, ngayon, discuss natin, ano yung force na in-apply natin? So, ano yung ginawa, ano yung na-create, ano yung ginawa nung force na in-apply natin sa object. Okay? So, put it tayo dito. So, a particle of mass acted upon by an unbalanced force experience an acceleration that has the same direction as the force and a magnitude that is directly proportional to the force. So, technically, guys, sinasabi dito, once na nag-apply ka nga ng force sa certain object na in equilibrium, technically, you will create an acceleration. Okay? So, yun yung second law of motion natin, is yung relationship between the external force and yung na-create mo dun sa object, which is what we call the acceleration. Which is acceleration is the change in velocity with respect to time. Okay? So, hindi technically dinedefine ng second law kung ano yung force. Dinedefine niya lang kung ano yung ginagawa ng force sa object na yon, which is nag-create ng acceleration. And nabanggit din dito, guys, once na kung ano yung direction ng force mo, so kung anong direction niya, kunwari, you push an object going to the right, of course, yung acceleration ng object natin is also going to the right. Okay? Same direction, and ayun, same direction lang naman. Okay? So, same direction nung force na in-apply natin. And of course, directly proportional. Okay, once na nag-create ka ng force, of course, mataas din yung acceleration mo. Pag mababa yung in-exert ng force, mababa din yung acceleration mo. Okay? So dito ngayon pumapasok yung infamous formula natin na pero bago tayo mag-proceed dun sa formula na, pakita natin how we come up with that formula. Okay? So, wait lang. Sorry. Okay, so ito. So, 'di ba? So, we have punta mo tayo sa second law agad. So, 'di ba? Sabi dun sa sa second bullet, the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the net force. Okay, so sinasabi, acceleration is directly proportional to the net force. Okay, as A as acceleration. Okay, acceleration. F as force. K is just a proportionality constant. Okay, proportionality constant. Okay. So, and may nabanggit din sa second bullet guys na acceleration is also inversely proportional to its mass. So, para siyang word problem. So, sinasabi dito, yung A natin is inversely proportional. So, ang sabihin nun, magkaiba yung nung acceleration and mass natin. So, naging ganyan siya. So, sinasabi dito guys, so, yung explanation ng mga yan, kung bakit may mga ganyan tayong equation, sinasabi dito, na once na yung, so dito tayo so sinasabi dito sa first equation, once the acceleration mo is going up, technically, yung force mo is also going up. So, kuwari, acceleration 1 mo is 5 meter per second squared, tapos, yung acceleration 2 mo is naging 7, technically, mag-i-increase din dapat yung force mo. Okay? And so on. So, pag bumaba, of course, bababa din yung mo. So, sa second naman, so sinasabi dito sa second equation natin, guys. Dagdag natin 'to. Okay? Yung sabi sa second equation natin is inversely proportional. What do we mean by inversely proportional is that once na nag-increase yung acceleration mo, okay? Dapat yung M mo, mass mo is bababa. Okay? And so on. So, ganun din dito. Okay, remember, yung proportionality constant is constant yan. So, kunwari, same value yung K nyo dito. Okay? Yung K nyo hindi nagbago. And ganun din dito. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, ayan. So, ibig sabihin dito, guys, kunwari, we have sa equation 1. Okay? For sa equation 1, so let's say we have an F force na 20 Newton and acceleration na approximately 5 meter per second squared. Okay? And of course, yung K nyo guys, hindi magbabago yan. So, yung K nyo is equal to technically 1/4. Tama, 1/4. Wala siyang unit. Okay? 1/4 lang siya. Okay, ganyan. Okay? So, once na yung F2 mo naging 10 Newton. So technically, yung A mo is magbabago din. Yung A2 mo is magbabago din kasi yung K mo is the same lang. So mangyayari, A2 mo is magiging 2.5 meter per second squared. So mapapansin nyo guys, nag-decrease parehas yung force and acceleration natin. Okay? So bumaba siya dito, 'di ba? So kasi nga, yun yung purpose ng proportionality constant. Constant siya. Okay? So, ganun din sa number 2. Kunwari, we have a mass of 5 kilograms and an acceleration of, let's say, 2 meter per second squared. And may K tayo na equal to 10 to 10. So, what if ang M natin is equal na to, sabi natin 15. Okay? M is equals to 15 kg. Technically, ang A natin is bababa siya kasi magiging 0.067 meter per second squared. Okay? So, tumaas yung mass mo, pero bumaba yung, kasi constant yung, natin. Okay? So, technically, yung itong two equation na to guys is we can combine them. Okay, we can combine them. So, combine natin siya and magiging A is equals to, so, ano ba ito? So, ayan. Magiging A is equals to F over M siya. Okay? Yan na yung working. Yan na yung bagong formula natin. Or, what we know is equals, as what we know as, force is equals to mass times acceleration. Okay? So, hindi sinasabi na force is equals to mass times acceleration. Sinasabi dito, yung external force na in-exert mo doon sa body is equal to the mass of the object and the acceleration you created doon. Okay? Or the other way around. Technically, A yung ano dito eh. Dapat, yung force na create mo divided by the mass of an object is equal to the acceleration. Pero, dahil ayaw nilang may division bar, I don't know why, pero ayan. Kaya tayo nag-come up dyan sa formula na yan. Okay? So, yun yung parang naging another discovery when it comes to second law of motion. Yung formula na yan. Okay? So, technically, second law is mahalaga siya when it comes to dynamics. Okay? Yung topic natin last week, technically, dynamics yon. Pero, ano lang yun pahapyaw lang ng dynamics. Kasi, dami pang topic yun, actually. So, ano pa lang tayo, uniformly accelerated motion, may projectile pa dapat, may free fall, mga ganun. May, ano mo tawag isang term? Basta, madami pang topic yun. Pero yun, dahil we focus mostly on aviation physics, hindi natin kailangan maging, parang, technically mas maalam. Okay na yun, enough na yung uniformly accelerated motion. Okay? So, ayan yung second law of motion natin, guys. Okay? So, ina-explain dito, ulitin ko, ina-explain sa second law of motion, yung relationship, yung external force, and yung na-create niyang acceleration sa object na yun. So, same object pa din yun. Okay? And next, proceed tayo ngayon sa third law of motion. So, sinasabi sa third law of motion, guys, is that technically, once na nag-exert ka ng force sa certain object, ang tendency ng object na yon is mag-exert din ng force directly doon sa external force. Okay? So, yun yon. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. That is, the force of interaction between two particles are equal in magnitude. Okay? So, if kung nag-apply ka ng 10 Newton, technically, yung object natin is mag-a-apply din ng 10 Newton. Okay? And oppositely directed. So, what do we mean by oppositely directed? Kung yung external force nyo, guys, is going to the right, of course, yung in-exert na force ng object natin must be going to the left. Okay? Along the same line of action. So, ayan. The mutual forces of action and reaction between two particles are equal, opposite, and collinear. So, ibig sabihin ng collinear, sa isang line of action lang sila. Okay, this law states that a single isolated force can't exist, and technically, force in nature always exists in pairs. Okay, so sabi lang dito na hindi porket nag-create ng acceleration yung object natin, hindi na siya nag-resist. There's always an resistance. Okay? Laging nag-create ng reaction force yung object natin. Okay, the action force is equal to the reaction force in opposite and direction. In all cases, the action and reaction force act on a different objects. Okay? So, yun lang yung third law of motion natin. Okay, so that's all for our topic for this week muna. So, before ko kayo dismiss, summarize natin lahat. So, we have 3 laws of motion. So, 3 laws of motion. First, we have the first law, which is what we call also law of inertia. Okay? Kasi, yung tendency nga ng object na mag-stay sa original state niya. Okay? Law of inertia. So next, second law is, tinatawag din natin siyang law of acceleration. Okay? Kasi, ah, ito yung na-create ng external force natin na nag-act dun sa object. So, once na nag-change ka ng velocity, nag-create ka ng acceleration. And lastly, number 3, is what we call law of interaction. Okay? So, it states that na once na nag-exert ka ng external force, our object must be always is creating a reaction force na oppositely directed doon sa external force na yon. Okay? So, ito yung three laws of motion natin. So, next, continuation of this topic will be on the next meeting na lang. Okay? So, thank you guys and end ko na to.